Whether you're a diehard sports fan, a hopeless romantic, or a comedy aficionado, the Xfinity 10G network was made for streaming it all. Worry less about buffering when streaming your favorite shows, movies, or live sports, and enjoy a better way to watch. Xfinity gives you a reliable connection for streaming, plus all the entertainment you love all in one place. Fear not, because now you can finally sit back, relax, and stream your favorite entertainment and sports like never before with the Xfinity 10G network.
Want the same expert advice you get from the pros in the store while shopping online at DiscountTire.com? Meet Treadwell, your personal online tire guide that matches you with the perfect tire for your vehicle. Get your best match in 1 minute or less with Treadwell by Discount Tire.
To get the Crime Writers on After Show right now, go to patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On, the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, and this week we're going back to Bundyville for another look at the Patriot movement in The Remnant. Then we'll talk about the clearing in which the daughter of a serial killer and a journalist try to determine whom he killed and whom he didn't. Joining me to get that done and a whole lot more is my real-life husband and true crime co-author, former TV journalist, and sexy voice tonk, Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca.
Also with us is journalist, true crime author, former defense investigator, licensed private investigator, certified cat lady, and storm disaster chaser, Laura Bricker. Hello, Laura.
That's me. The whole family went out to look at storm damage tonight, because that's what we do.
Sometimes it's Christmas lights. Sometimes it's trick-or-treating.
Sometimes it's branches down.
Sometimes it's uprooted trees in Little Exeter, New Hampshire.
It was a big tree.
And finally, our captain of woke cynicism, the author behind the noir novels known as the City Trilogy, and our brilliant Patreon book club host, Toby Ball. Hello, Toby.
Ahoy there.
Now, Toby, I really want to give you a chance to plug your book club podcast right now, because when this podcast drops, your book club will be up. As we're taping this, the final edit is being done, and our very handsome editor, Henry Lavoie, tells me...
Very handsome.
This is, hands down, the very best episode of the Balls Deep Dive Book Club podcast he's ever edited. Toby, do you just want to tell our listeners who the guests are on our Patreon exclusive Book Club podcast this time around?
Sure. So we had Marcia Chatlin, who's been on before, but she's from Undisclosed, and she teaches at Georgetown.
And The Waves on Slate.
That too. And then Shirley Laro, who's a listener, and she teaches at the Community College of Manhattan, I think. But anyway, she's awesome. And then Madeline Barron from... In the Dark.
I think you mean Madeline Barron, as my Henry said as I walked in the door.
Did she read?
Yeah, so actually it's an awesome conversation, partly because I don't say a whole lot, but also partly because there's a good mix. It was really fun just to kind of hang back and listen to them because, Madeline obviously has a very sort of unique and uniquely informed perspective on this. And then both Marcia and Shirley have taught it. Yeah. And have really good insights, I thought. And sort of the three of them play off each other really well. So it was really fun for me recording it just to listen to them talk about it and the exchange of ideas and stuff. So if you've never checked it out before, this is a good time.
That's right.
What's the book again?
It's The New Jim Crow. It's basically about how... our system of mass incarceration, and she really focuses on African-American men, is sort of intentionally sort of controlling minorities in our country. And that's like, it goes from slavery to Jim Crow to the era of mass incarceration. That's kind of her thesis. But yeah, it's a really good conversation.
All right. So you can get Toby's Balls Deep Dive Book Club podcast right now on our Patreon. You can also get a brand new episode of Leave It to Bricker, in which Laura Bricker tries to figure out which person in her little town won one of the largest Mega Millions jackpots ever awarded with a single ticket that was sold in her little town. And apparently she's trying to track down that millionaire for no other reason than pure curiosity.
Yeah. Yep.
And if that's not enough to get you to pay $6 on Patreon, I don't know what is. We have a very deep conversation about race in America with two well-known scholars on the subject and Madeline Barron, and a podcast in which Laura tries to chase down a lottery winner. I mean, seriously, we're making so many things.
Don't forget Married with Podcast.
It's also a brand new episode of Married with Podcast in which you and I, Kevin, really lay bare the inner workings of our relationship.
Oh my.
Not as lusty as that sounds.
Listen, our Patreon followers are very happy. And if you want to join them, just go to patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia. And thus ends the plug portion of this podcast. Are you guys ready to review some true crime stuff?
Yeah.
Pretty sure.
Oregon Public Broadcasting and Longreads return with a sequel to their award-winning 4 Thumbs Up podcast, Bundyville. Host Leah Satilli picks up on more of the Patriot movement in The Remnant. The podcast literally starts off with a bang, and we hear that Glenn Jones is threatening to blow up the house of Joshua and Tiffany Clough.
What if I told you that in the summer of 2016, there was a bombing on U.S. soil you never heard about?
911, what is your emergency?
Somebody shot up my house.
It happened in the tiny town of Panaca, Nevada. Tiffany Clough was at home with her 3 daughters when a man came to the door and said he was going to blow her house up. She should get the kids and leave.
He said he was going to blow them up.
He said he was going to kill you?
She grabbed the kids, rushed outside, and called 911. Then, everything blew up.
What could have been written off as a deadly dispute between former coworkers may actually have more to do with the anti-government movement Cliven Bundy embodied. The mystery links Jones to a slain protester now hailed as a martyr by the Patriot movement. The Remnant is another deep dive into the dangerous world of militiamen, conspiracy theories, and would-be domestic terrorists. Now, spoiler alert, we are going to be discussing plot points from Bundyville, The Remnant. So if you want to remain spoiler-free, just go to the time code listed in our show notes for our thumbs up or thumbs down review. Kevin, quick question for you.
Yeah.
Characters in this podcast, you and I were debating it a little bit while we were on our vacation listening to the show, which, by the way, is a binge listen. They dropped all the episodes.
Right.
It makes a very good binge,
Yep.
right? Who is the scarier character in this podcast? That dude Keebler that Leah talks to at the truck stop?
Uh-huh.
Or Lavoy Finicum's wife, who completely transforms from grieving widow to crazy-ass racist in another piece of the podcast?
No,
what do you think?
It's the guy from the truck stop.
Keebler?
Keebler, yeah. Yeah, because I think she put it actually very well. You talk to him for the first hour, right, and he seems like a normal person, and then it's really just this time-release capsule of crazy.
Yeah.
And that's when you find out where his mind really is at.
You can't do the Pledge of Allegiance in our school, but now we got Muslims praying and everything else in the hallways in our schools and in our classrooms. And teachers are now making kids dress up like Muslims.
I asked Keebler to give me an example of where this was happening, but he just said,
A number of places. Yeah.
It's unsettling because, for some people you can argue politics and maybe they're not going to believe you, but you're just not going to believe, like, facts.
Right.
Makes him very dangerous.
Yeah.
Was he the one, they were like sitting in the booth in like a diner and all of a sudden he was like, they're looking at us. They're here right
Yes.
now.
Yep.
Don't.
That
And
guy.
I was like, what is going on right now? Oh my God. I'm like, this is like Stranger Things where the guy's like talking Russian and they're driving around with the sheriff or something.
The ironic thing is, there's like a joke says, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not really out to get you. I mean, here's a guy who, sees government agents everywhere, but he really was set up in
By the government.
In what you can argue is an entrapment case. So he has see, the government, I'm not making this up. They really did. They arrested me and they tried to set me up and blah, blah, blah.
No, but they actually did.
And but to him, it verifies his paranoia.
Well, that's the thing, though. And that's what's so interesting about this podcast is that, Toby sent me a note about how this is all criminally underreported. And Leah makes this point again and again in the podcast. And Toby, I'd love for you to speak to this, that there is this idea in journalism and also sort of like in public affairs and public policy stuff that these fringe things and these fringe people, it's better to not report it, to ignore them, to not give them oxygen, et cetera, because then you bring their thinking to the forefront and you showcase them and you give them space to talk. But we're actually talking about people who actually are committing actual acts of violence and are influencing other parts of our culture. Can you just talk about that? How, like with your note to me that you said how it's criminally underreported?
So I guess there's a couple things. One is I think the whole don't give them oxygen, may have been effective like 20 years ago, but there's so many alternative routes to getting the word out now that I don't know if that is as valid anymore, because I think you can get on the internet and if you have any interest at all, pretty quickly find it. Mm-hmm. These are people who, they talk about like the threat matrix, which is like, do you have the capability and do you have I can't remember exactly what the word is, but it's basically desire or intent. And this is a group of people who have both, right? They're heavily armed. They also have these strong anti-government feelings. And as a matter of fact, people associated with the movement, were responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing. I mean, Tim McVeigh was part of this. Standoffs. They talk about, the bombing that they're talking about in this podcast are also sort of related because it's a guy who gets kind of sucked into all this as well. Maybe the oxygen thing is part of the reluctance, but I think there's also been a reluctance because of how political it is. I think these people identify as conservatives, although I don't think they're sort of what we would think of as mainstream conservatives, but they do identify themselves as being on that area of sort of the political spectrum. And I think that, news organizations also find that daunting.
It is.
Because I think they are concerned about being, the liberal media and all this stuff if they report on it. But, I think this is one of those cases where, this is actually a threat in our country, not in all parts of our country, and not all people who are involved in this are threats, but it is something that probably deserves attention.
One of the things I think I really agree with Toby on is that these movements, because they are now aligning themselves with a seated president and a party, whereas, 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, it would have been very easy for the media to sort of say, this is fringe, let's not give them oxygen. Now the media is saying to report on them as they are is being, in some way, there's a fear of bias because you're not, it's like, oh, you just don't like conservatives. That's not what it is. And I think that's one of the things that makes this podcast so brave. And if you want to just question my judgment on that, look at the Apple reviews of this podcast. Look at them. Because for every 5-star review that this podcast gets for its objectively, Kevin, I know I'm not being objective, like almost perfect production, great writing, in-depth reporting, like complete storytelling, every 5th one is like, the host is just some government bootlicker who doesn't like Republicans. And like literally that's not what the podcast is about. But it goes to show why this is underreported. And Laura, I know that this isn't something you necessarily would have listened to otherwise. How did it make you feel listening to it?
Well, I was cursing Toby for a while because he's the one who suggested we listen to us. And I was like, thanks a lot, Toby. I'm now in the fetal position and I'm never leaving my house again. But, I was kind of conflicted because I'm listening to it and I guess I know this is going on, but I guess I kind of try to shield myself a little bit. And listening to this podcast, I really couldn't. I had to acknowledge that this patriot movement is really it's organized and they're ready. And if our boy Trump doesn't get in, we have guns. And I was like, holy shit. So I was conflicted because I'm like, yeah, again, do you report it or not report it? But also I want to know what's going on, but I also don't want to know what's going on because it's kind of frightening when you think about the level of organization. And when you realize, when you look back at season 1 of this podcast, that started with the Bundy family, and then you look at all the people that sort of glommed onto them when that was happening, and they didn't necessarily share the exact same, grievances and beliefs, but they rallied. And now to see how that has sort of, I wouldn't say snowballed, but continued, I felt I didn't feel very good when I was listening to this podcast. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Kevin, what about you? I mean, we talk about this a lot, the sort of, one of the things that Leah looked at in the first season of Bundyville, which was basically why the Bundys were radicalized. And even though we may not agree with some of the tactics of that family, we may not even agree with their point of view, the journey to radicalization in that family was in some ways, especially with the dad, Cliven, like logical, right?
Right.
He was lied to by the government as a child that was doing nuclear testing near his home, but he'd also spent time south of the border, and he had a lot of sympathy for immigrants, and he had a lot of political and social leanings that didn't align with the people who Leah said were itching for a fight that sort of came around him because of just general anti-government sentiments. But this season looks at scarier, more nuanced part of that movement. How do you feel about the telling of this story and how much we need to know about it as news consumers?
It's interesting because it is a really deep dive, and I'm wondering, how quote unquote entertaining this is. I think it's sort of a must listen. Look, it's not like super fun, right? It's not like
that's an understatement.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I might not be. I might be unartful with my words about this. I feel more like you have a duty to listen and to understand this part of our society versus, this is a really interesting serial killer case,
Yeah, but I also think it's really well made.
Oh, I don't.
And I think the choice to drop it all at once was the right
great,
choice because I think I would have been freaked out if I weren't a podcast reviewer. Like, would I listen past episode 3? I might be like, I don't fucking want to know any more about this. But because it was a binge, like, I wanted to binge it. The writing is fantastic. As much as I say that we should never, like, talk about the sort of the quality of the voices of narrators, especially female narrators, Leah Satili is a freaking awesome writer and narrator for podcasts. I would listen to anything she made. The production is really good. And the way she tries to sort of marry it, like, for instance, Kevin, did you know about the whole Washington wanting to break off those people who want to, like, have, like, liberty as a separate state?
No.
Wouldn't you find that interesting?
Yeah.
And when she doesn't want to go there, or she has to go there, but she's also told that it's basically like going into The Handmaid's Tale, and they go there. Isn't that interesting?
It is, especially, look, if you're like us and you live on the East Coast, there's a whole part of, like, Western culture that, you just don't get, right? And I mean that like from a Westerner's point of view, it's like, you don't get us.
Yeah.
There's a rural part of that, a more deeply religious part of that too, right? And it all comes together in sort of the frontier where the American spirit was forged. And yeah, I think every community, not every community, but every region has a similar group of
extremists,
libertarian-minded.
We have them here.
Anti-government, right? There's always some, we want to separatists.
Yeah,
we had the Free Staters, right?
Well, we had the Browns.
Still do.
Yeah, we also have. Well, they're not extremists, but there's this mysterious place up the road from me. Now, it's like an incorporated community, but only once a year can you go in.
Oh.
I'm gonna bleep out the name of that thing that you just said, but
that's fine. That's fine. I may have to go there sometime. It freaks me out. They have the fair, and I'm like, what is that place?
Now, Laura, there are many instances in this podcast where I felt as a listener like Leah and her presence just reporting this was threatened and it was a dangerous situation. She went to that really weird meeting where they screened that Lavoie Finicum movie and they wouldn't let her tape the audio of it. And then she was like, no, I didn't need to tape it. I can just tell you what it was about. It was just propaganda. Yeah. But there were armed people there who were like clearly targeting and looking at them. And then they went to that like Marple place, that Handmaid's Tale place. How did you feel about the potential danger to this reporting team?
I felt like there was some danger, and I was listening to this and I was thinking, I don't know if I would go in there. I felt afraid for her, and it was sort of reminiscent of when we listened to Caliphate and we listened to that reporter go out to meet people that were terrorists. And you're thinking, oh, this is not good. And with Leah going into these scenarios, you know, with the one guy who's deemed like, what was he, like the most dangerous person on the terrorist watch list or something? I mean, whatever it was, I can't remember specifically, but good for her. I was like, wow, you've got some nerves of steel to be able to do that. But it was definitely frightening because I was thinking you're kind of exposing yourself as a journalist in a way when you take on a story like this, because it sounds like some of these people come across as normal and then all of a sudden, whoop, they're not.
Yeah.
And they have guns and, you know, not to stereotype, but we heard that in this podcast. So when you're looking at her going in and thinking about if she's reporting something that's the truth, but maybe they don't necessarily like it, like what's going to happen to her?
One of the themes I found very interesting in the podcast was the gaslighting that many of the subjects of the stories do, insisting that race is not an issue for them when they are on their face racist. They say racist things in public on microphones. And there's this whole ridiculous gaslighting where when you challenge them on the race stuff, it's like, what are you talking about? No. And then you have people on microphones in public forums saying super racist things. Toby, that sort of radicalization around race, around sort of these faux, I call them faux religious ideals because to me they're very twisted. It's sort of like the construct that's used to excuse horrible thinking. Is this what you're talking about when you said this stuff is criminally underreported, that people aren't pushing back, that someone just says, like, what are you talking about? I'm not racist, when there's a million racist statements on the record? Like, is that what you're talking about?
I guess a little bit. I mean, part of it, you know, I think it's easier to ignore it in some ways. I think the underreporting is that it's an undercurrent and it's a subculture that more than most others has a potential to cause some problems, to
Violence.
Make some news for violent reasons. You know, I think there's this weird mix, and I think you get it with Matt Shea, the state senator from Washington State, where it's this sort of weird mix of, you know, white supremacy. You can't even really call it fundamentalist Christianity. It's just like weird, sort of racist, violent Christianity, in radical individualism, and then this like sort of deification of America.
Yeah.
You know, the way they talk about America is in more of a religious way than like describing your country. And so I think that's the other thing that makes them kind of dangerous, is because having this particular conception of America and then also having sort of this religion-like fervor about it, I think makes you predisposed to do things that most people wouldn't do in order to preserve the way you think that America ought to be. There's potential there for bad stuff to happen.
Well, you know, it was interesting to me listening to this podcast. I was thinking about a story that came out at the end of June where Oregon, the state legislature, was about to pass a climate change bill. And then Republicans in the state Senate, many of whom sort of identify with some of these fringe ideas, left the state so that the state Senate couldn't form a quorum.
That's right. Yeah, I remember this.
And the governor had to call in the police. There was militia threats on the legislature over this issue. And then I remember hearing coverage of this and seeing coverage of it on TV and hear coverage of it like on NPR, where they were like interviewing these state senators who were like, I'm sorry, but like the tactics were bananas that they were doing. And the talking points were like very, very extreme. And they were very much normalizing this idea that we're just following the rules. Like we're just fleeing the state. So we don't have to do this duty because we just don't agree with the over whatever. But they were using some of these same talking points. These are elected officials.
Right.
And Matt Shea in this podcast is doing that.
A lot of people in the media, some people even here today, have come out publicly and tried to smear other people. And I want to tell you something about that. We can't become those dirty, godless, hateful people.
Shay says he wants the media to report the truth about him.
The antidote to that slander and defamation is always truth, isn't it?
Now, Kevin, there was a surprise podcast crossover in this show.
I didn't pick up on it, but you did.
Spokane, Washington, Sheriff Ozzie, who was a villain in Dan Taberski's Running from Cops, actually is the voice of reason in this podcast when it comes to dealing with some of these extremists.
But Knezovich is one of Shay's harshest critics. He told me he's received multiple death threats from people in Shay's camp. They seem to be happening more and more.
How do you deal with this?
Well, I've got my estate in order. I've got my will done. The kids have all been briefed. Don't take this as me being flippant. Nobody wants to die.
Yeah.
I came to grips with death a long, long time ago, though.
Well, I mean, I think he believes strongly in what he does as a law enforcement officer, and it really, for him, all comes down to, in both cases, the protection of his officers.
Mm-hmm.
And in Running from Cops, he's there because he feels like the PR is, they're on the wrong side of that.
Right.
People need to see this is a dangerous job, and these are the things that we're dealing with. That was his case. He was the one who brought up the Dallas shootings, and the people don't remember that, and I think there's this too. He's talking about officer safety. It's not out of character.
Well, for me, the lesson I learned hearing Sheriff Ozzie on this podcast, and this is what I think this podcast does as a service, is the spectrum of extremism. Because we listened to Running from Cops, and I characterized Sheriff Ozzie as being like one of the scariest people I've ever heard on a podcast.
Yeah.
And on this podcast, he's the least scary person on the podcast. And that, I think, speaks to a spectrum of like where we are as a country, and it's really something. So on that note, I think we should do what we do. Mm-hmm. Let's tell our audience, thumbs up or thumbs down review. Should they listen to season 2 of Bundyville? It's called The Remnant. Laura Bricker, I'm going to start with you. What do you think?
Well, this is conflicting. So I would like to give it a thumbs up because it's very well done. It's very well reported. So I'm going to give it a thumbs up. But you know what? If you want to not be like me and be in the fetal position on the floor, then you probably shouldn't listen to this because it's a hard reality to listen to this podcast, but it is very well done.
Toby, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down for Bundyville season 2, The Remnant?
I really love this podcast. I thought it was really interesting the whole way through. I think it's important. Leah and her crew are just doing an incredible job. I think it ranks up there as far as writing and reporting with some of the best stuff that we've listened to. So I give it a big thumbs up. I thought it was really, really good.
Yeah, me too. Big thumbs up for me. I love that they dropped it as a binge because it was very bingeable, very difficult topic, but once you're in, you kind of want to hear where it's going to go. A very smart storytelling device they do to start with the bombing, which doesn't really come back until the end, except it's a very compelling place to start, which was smart production and storytelling. The one thing I will say about this show and the team behind this show, it's a great example of very, very clean writing. Like the narration is clean, the reporting is clean. It's completely above board and completely ethical. And when Leah talks about the forces at work, she's not talking about what she thinks they are. She's talking about what she has shown us they are. And that is the mark of great journalism. And that is why I love Bundyville. And that is why I really love The Remnant. So huge thumbs up for me. What about you, Kevin?
I'm a thumbs up. Not way up. I mean, I think you cannot fault the reporting, the effort that went into this. They covered, thousands of miles just to get tape and to find out stuff. We didn't even talk about like the guy's brother.
Yeah.
And like that great interview. There was a bunch of other, really interesting people.
You mean the good guy brother?
The good guy brother.
Yeah.
But I think that, like Laura said, it will not brighten your day.
Moving on. Pineapple Street Media has partnered with Gimlet on a new series, The Clearing.
April Blasio has a lot of questions about her dad, Edward Wayne Edwards. Questions about who he was and what he did.
I had no tangible evidence that my dad killed anyone.
Questions she's hoping I can help her answer.
Oh, they are labeled.
Yes.
And Ed Edwards? He left behind a lot of clues, like a box of cassettes police confiscated from his trailer.
And how many cassettes are we looking at here?
It's about 60, I believe.
Feedback.
Over his long life of crime, Edward Wayne Edwards admitted to killing 5 people, but there are those who think he's connected to a ton of unsolved murders, thanks to one man who's made that conspiracy his life's work. In the podcast The Clearing, host Josh Dean and Edward's daughter April have teamed up to learn what other crimes he may have committed and which ones he most probably did not.
He always uses letters and numbers. The 5th letter of our alphabet is E. So killing 3 on 5-5 was something he had done in the past.
And who were these other three people?
The West Memphis 3. 5-5 and 93.
They were juveniles, right?
Yep. There were 3 kids.
Bullshit.
But your father also killed 3 kids.
Bullshit.
In 1955 in
Bullshit.
Chicago.
Bullshit.
Yeah, it went before he came here. Yes, he did.
No, he didn't. Bullshit.
Filled with tons of tape from police investigations, new interviews, and the audio diaries of Edwards himself, The Clearing looks to peel away the conspiracy theories and get to the heart of what this serial killer actually did, while also examining the underpinnings of the true crime industrial complex. Spoiler alert, we're going to be talking about plot points from The Clearing, so if you want to remain spoiler-free, go to the time code listed in our show notes. Now, Kevin, I have to throw this your way.
Yeah.
Josh Dean is the host of this podcast. He's a well-known magazine writer, great features personality that I am familiar with and know and believe I may have booked on some public radio interviews in my past life. Mm-hmm. But I actually learned about this podcast from a Facebook post from Jonathan Manhevar, who now works at Pineapple Street Media, is an alum of This American Life.
Okay.
I believe that this podcast, The Clearing, whatever we think of the story, the plot, what happened, I'm just going to throw it out there. In terms of production and mixing and music and leitmotifs and themes, I think this is one of the most perfectly produced podcasts I've listened to in a very long time. What do you think?
Well, I don't think I liked it as much as you did, but I mean, it's very, very good. Yeah, but I don't think it really takes off until episode 4.
Well, what I'm talking about, though, is the production. So what I think the argument I really want to make is the production style. And the use in particular of sort of like leitmotifs and music in this podcast. And sort of the way that Josh delivers it. Yes, it's very Leon Neyfakh. It's very straight. But can I just play you a sample of like the musical leitmotifs?
Please do.
Here's a clarinet for family.
When April was little, he supported the family by touring around, telling his story of redemption to church groups and high schools and police academies. But she also knew he couldn't hold down a job.
Here's electronica for story. Boom.
The sheriff's clerk, Sharon, she handed us all these tapes, neatly packed in 3 white boxes. When she first heard from April, a few months before our visit, Sharon was super curious to know what was on those tapes.
So do you see there that they use like texture in this story in a way that we don't often hear in these shows?
Yeah, it's not amateur hour. I get it. Yeah, it's very clever. It's an interesting concept because it's really different from any other pie. I mean, this is what Happy Face is not.
Yes.
Right? It's in
the
perspective.
anti-Happy Face.
And yeah. It's like, okay, this is what we're actually going to try to achieve by looking into this guy's past. And then again, like I said, I think when we get to the end of episode 4, well, even the start of episode 4, I mean, it really takes off.
Yeah. So Laura, I really want to talk about April. Because even though Josh tells us really in episode 4 that he kind of thought this whole thing might be a magazine article, it's April that's kind of the driving force behind this. Kevin and I just sort of joked about this being the anti-Happy Face, but she is the daughter of the bad guy here. Can you just talk a little bit about what you think her role in this podcast is?
Well, I think that she's sort of the catalyst for this podcast, like you said, becoming more than just a magazine story because right from the first episode, when you hear how she always thought something was a little off about her childhood, and she's getting up in the middle of the night Googling places that they lived because she felt like her father might be connected to crimes there. You immediately sense there's something a little bit different about her approach to what her father may or may not have done than other people that we've heard in the same situation. And also, she obviously, this is like, can you even imagine if this was somebody, your father that had been involved in these type of crimes? But the way that she talks about it and the way that she is involved in the case and the way that she talks with Josh, she comes across as a very likable character. And so I think that this podcast really becomes more, yes, it's about, and every time I hear Eddie Edwards, I keep thinking of our old liquor commissioner. Every time
yes.
I hear this, I'm like, it's not that Eddie Edwards. So, this podcast really becomes, yes, it's about him, but it's really her journey and her desire to find the truth. And she's not saying he didn't do these things. But she's also saying, he may or may not have done all these things that this other wingnut guy sort of throws out there to see what will stick.
I just want to follow you up with you on that, Laura, because I found myself asking this question. Like, April fully knows her father is a serial killer. She knows it.
Yes.
And she turned him in. Like, she fucking knows it.
Yes.
She knows he's a bad guy. She's also not comfortable with him being portrayed as a worse guy than he was. Although she's saying, like, show me the evidence and I'm fine with it. But, like, if it's not true, don't say it. I find that fascinating. Like, she's not defending him.
No,
she's like, just let him be the bad guy he is and don't make him worse, but also don't make him better. Like, let the facts. It's fascinating. What is this? Like her psychological journey? Like, what do you think that's about?
Well, I think that's it. And the thing is, when you listen to her talk about him, I mean, you expect to hear somebody who is completely overwhelmed and traumatized by the fact that this is their father. And that's not how she presents. She's just kind of matter of fact about it, but also, she's suitably horrified, but she's not crippled by that knowledge. She's actually seems almost empowered to find out the truth, which is what makes it so compelling to listen to her, I think. So I don't know what it is about her makeup. Maybe it's because she had to become adaptable as a child, as she's moving every 5 minutes. Every time he's like, let's go, it's 3 a.m, we're getting out of here. Who knows what went into that, in terms of making her that type of person, but it's fascinating to listen to.
Now, Toby, you sent me a note. The first note you sent me in your list was, you don't find the podcast super interesting. I want to give you a chance because I have obviously completely latched on to that fact that this is interesting. I'd like to hear your counterpoint on why you don't love this as much as I do. I'm just going to give you the floor. Go ahead, Toby Ball.
It's kind of interesting to try and explain why something isn't interesting. I guess my feeling is that a lot of the arc is not all that unexpected. Like, once you kind of hear what his kind of intentions are, there's little anecdotes that I thought were interesting, but
Kentucky Fried Chicken? Is that what you're talking about? You're talking about the Kentucky Fried Chicken?
The Kentucky Fried Chicken thing was amusing.
So, he makes comments throughout the whole dinner. Oh, this is good Kentucky Fried Chicken. Oh, these biscuits are just like Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I'm kicking my husband on the table. Would you just shut up? Just let it go. Who cares? Just eat. It's good.
Then after a while of dropping hints, I'll just come right out and say, you're an idiot. I see this stuff right there in the kitchen.
But even in that situation, he would continue to...
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that he 100% made the dinner just for no reason.
The thing where he shows up pretending he's a cop and talks to the neighbor is super creepy.
A couple days later, my mom, it hits her.
Oh, shit. That was Edwards.
Just to be clear, the cop with the mustache, that was Ed Edwards. Trying to picture, because he had sunglasses and a hat, he had disguised himself pretty well.
Oh, he hadn't. It was a fake mustache. It was a bad fake mustache.
And the fact that he was on What's My Line or whatever that show was.
Tell the truth.
By a variety of logics, we have arrived at the following conclusion. A pair of twos on each end. The votes are all in. Will the real Ed Edwards please stand up?
Numbers 1 and 2 both fake like they're about to rise. And then actual Ed Edwards stands, with the wide smile of a man who's just conned everyone into believing he's actually reformed.
It's kind of good, but the arc did not, to me, seem to be particularly surprising or unusual beyond these little anecdotes. I don't know. I just kind of felt like we spent a lot of time listening to him talk listening to other people talk without a whole hell of a lot going on, except for an occasional little anecdote that seemed a little unusual. But once you realize that what he really wants to do is he wants to be executed. And then there's a lot of time spent about like the ins and outs of what he's going to have to do to get transferred to Ohio so he can get executed there, and the disappointments. And, you know, I don't know. I just kind of felt I had a hard time connecting with it. And then again, until, like Kevin said, I thought the fourth episode sort of really changed it quite a bit. But, you know, at that point, you're like 2 hours in or more. Like, again, I mean, it's not like it's bad. The idea that there's this treasure trove of audio, like this guy was such a narcissist that he felt like he better record all his thoughts all the time. And then you have access to that. And the guy's also like deranged. Like that's like a treasure trove of stuff. But the reality is that what he's talking about isn't super interesting. Like you try to think like, well, what if this guy wasn't, what if we didn't think he was a serial killer? Is any of this stuff then become interesting? And I felt like a lot of it was only interesting because you thought you were getting some kind of insight into this sort of terrifying person. I don't know. I didn't find that particularly compelling. The fourth episode I thought was really interesting.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that fourth episode. But before we do, Kevin, can I just like make a counterpoint to what Toby said, and you can disagree with me if you want.
All right.
So we hear about sort of the tape and, you know, Edward Edwards, which I know he changed his name and that was not his name. But my first question for someone named Edward Edwards is like, why do your parents hate you so much? Anyway, one of the things that stuck out to me that I loved was when April took the podcast producers to explore one of her memories.
Mm-hmm.
And she had this memory of her father, like take this very specific place, this very specific park, taking her to see a crime scene. And she's like, and they were very doubtful. They get there and they find the place, and it's actually where those victims were found. And it really was a crime scene. And it very much seems to me like those setup episodes, which I don't think you loved either, and which Toby clearly didn't love before episode 4, were about testing April's veracity so that we could trust that they've brought her into this. And I know it took a kind of a long time to get there. I thought it was really good. And it built a lot for me of investment in, unlike Happy Face, where it was just like a fever dream.
Yeah.
It built a lot for me of like, it was a slow build, but I know I'm impatient. And I always say like slow builds are a barrier. Why did I like it so much and you guys didn't?
I really liked it too, Rebecca. So
okay, I'm glad so it wasn't just me.
No, I really liked it, and I really liked the music that they used, and the music was even kind of quirky to me. Some of the music that like it was like like kind of lighter sounding music than you would.
Yes.
And I was like, this is an interesting music choice, and I loved some of the little quips that Josh threw in, where I was like, that's kind of funny. I bet he's got a good sense of humor in person.
$1 bill.
The limitations of a podcast prevent me from showing you this video. You can find it yourself on YouTube if you really want. But let me save you the time. This random Santa, I'm not sure who he is, but he's not Ed Edwards.
I do really like Josh.
Yeah.
I think he is a great storyteller. You definitely can tell from his writing, while he's not a broadcast journalist, he's good with words. He also knows how to take his script and make it sound like he's talking slightly extemporaneously. So it's good in that way. Like a Sarah Koenig, like a Leon Neyfakh. You know, there are some, folks that are just sort of like spinning a tale. Not in a fantabulous way. No, right. Not in a fantastic way, but sort of like just really connecting with you and talking sort of generally about, this is what I found. Not reading a report, but sort of reporting back to you.
Now, let's talk about episode 4, where it took a big turn for you, I know, because I think I walked in on you listening and you said, I've just changed my mind about this whole thing. John Cameron, who is the guy that we hear has been propagating this story, like we saw the news reports post Making a Murderer thing, like that's Edward Edwards in the footage. He's really the one who killed Teresa Hallback, and he really killed John Benet Ramsey, and he's also the Zodiac. One guy is responsible for this, John Cameron. Our introduction to him is that Josh Dean goes to interview him, and he's in the hospital.
On morphine with a punctured lung.
On morphine because he says he had a drunken fall. What a way to introduce an unreliable source, right?
Yeah, but his unreliability is the reason he's a character in this at all. At all. They're not going to go find like, oh, here's the chief inspector of the case. They're really there to talk to the guy who has created this fable that he deeply believes in. He's, White Whale and Ahab.
For the true crime industrial complex.
Yeah, well, or I mean, not even that. I mean, just it's so far out that, like you said, that the radio host for Coast to Coast.
Oh my God, I have to talk about that.
Was even he was tongue-tied.
There's another moment on Coast to Coast when Cameron spins the story so wild that when he's finished, the host just pauses for an uncomfortably long time.
You research these kind of cases, you see all of these stories. Do you ever think that the obsession of tracking this kind of story
I have to tell you, Coast to Coast has a special place in my home.
Oh no!
My Uncle Walter, who comes to stay with us every Christmas for an extended visit, he has insomnia, and his favorite thing to do at night, he has finally fessed up, is listen to Coast to Coast. So for his birthday this year, I got him a 6-month subscription to the podcast, so we didn't have to stay up till 1 a.m. to listen to it.
Nice.
Oh,
very nice.
You're sweet.
So I was so excited when I heard this. I'm like, oh, this is great. I can't wait to tell Uncle Wall about this.
Now, Toby, I kept thinking about you listening to episode 4 because I felt like April, who, by the way, as we mentioned, is the daughter of the serial killer, Edward Edwards, is playing you in this podcast when she's listening to John Cameron's claims on the Today Show.
Edwards ties a lot of his murders to 666.
Okay, that's just absolutely ludicrous. To me, that is just totally ludicrous. It's crazy. I have no idea how he came up with that idea.
But that's where the evidence led.
What evidence? Seriously, what evidence? And he's not really...
Lacey was killed on Christmas Eve. Her body was found on Palm Sunday. He stages his murders on Christian holidays.
No, he doesn't.
4th of July, Memorial Days.
No, he doesn't.
Anything that's a significant day in history.
You also suggest he may be responsible for this.
Yeah. So, and then, all right, now the ones that he confessed to, were any of those on any holidays? No.
So, Toby, do you think that April is the Toby Ball of this podcast?
Geez, yeah, I hope so. No, I mean, this is where I thought the podcast kind of like suddenly got interesting. Where you've got this woman who, grew up with this monster as a father, and she knows he did terrible things, and then she has to deal with this guy who's like, he was the Zodiac killer, and he killed this person. Have you ever heard of a private? Do you think your dad ever chartered jets? It's like, what, you think he chartered a jet so he could fly to Denver and kill JonBenet Ramsey and then get back? I mean, what the hell are you talking about? That was interesting. It was interesting to have that dynamic set up. And that guy is just so full of shit. It's unbelievable. When you were talking earlier about the Remnant, and you talked about how you thought it was, clever framing to start off with the bomb and then sort of move on from there to sort of the meat of what they're going to talk about. I almost think that, maybe if they could have started with something like this, it might have caught my interest a little bit more. And I hate that idea of criticizing something because they didn't make it the way you wanted them to make it. You got to kind of take it on its own merits. I don't know. I guess I'll save it for the recommendations, but I think if you can hang in there to get to the 4th one, there's a good payoff.
Now, Laura, at the end of the 4th episode, this is why I put the extra spoiler alert in our spoiler alerts, there's a bit of a kicker because the podcast tells us, first we're going to look at what this guy did, and then we're going to look at the larger thing. And it does take 3 episodes to get to the larger thing. But then at the end of the 4th episode, maybe he actually did do something that John Cameron thinks he may have done, and they're going to now maybe solve that. What did you think of that?
I don't even know. I will reserve judgment until I hear what they have to say because, I guess it is probable when you hear this guy. I mean, he wrote a book about his crimes. He wants a lot of attention about his crimes. He's pretty narcissistic. And then when you hear kind of details of things that he's done and the fact that they were moving all the time, it is plausible to think that maybe there are other things that he was involved in. I'm going to go on a limb here. I don't think it's Jean Benet, but I don't think it's Teresa Halbach. But it is going to be interesting to hear where they go next with this.
Do you think he's the Zodiac?
No. But am I going to eat my words? I don't know. I mean, who knows? But I won't be surprised if he's linked to more crimes.
Well, I mean, I think they have handled this podcast so well to start. I can't imagine this is a fake out, or it's worse, like what happened with Serial, where they have these great cliffhangers and never fulfill them. So my interest is now piqued as to what they might actually find out.
Well, I think we should do what we do and tell our listeners, should they check out The Clearing? It's a podcast from Pineapple Street Media. I think the partnership with Gimlet, that's just who's distributing it and doing the marketing for them. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's the Pineapple Street people have made this podcast, The Clearing, with Josh Dean. Thumbs up or thumbs down review. What do you think, Laura Bricker? What should our audience take away? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
I'm going with thumbs up. I really liked this podcast. I liked the narrator's style. I liked, his manner of delivery and his writing. And I loved April, the daughter of the killer. And I also really liked the quirky music that they used and the production quality of this podcast. So I really liked this. It was really interesting to listen to. There's also, you've got tapes. We've got access to the killer himself. That's always fun. So I would say thumbs up.
Toby Ball, I can't wait to hear what you think. Thumbs up or thumbs down from The Clearing. Where do you finally land, Toby Ball?
I guess I'll give it a thumbs up. The writing's good. Everything basically about it is good, other than the first 3 episodes. I don't even know if it's slow going, but it's just, I didn't find it super interesting. And then suddenly the 4th episode comes, and it's like, oh, well, that's a whole different deal. And I should also say that I think that other people will like it more than I did. I'm just not that interested in like the whole serial killer genre. If people are interested in it, there's probably a lot there for them. And then again, you get to the 4th, and it suddenly springs to life, like Kevin said. So I'll give it a thumbs up, but it's kind of a qualified one.
Yeah, I'm giving it a huge thumbs up, and I just want to say for everybody out there who disagreed when we said that Happy Face was, what did you say, Kevin? Fucking hot mess of a podcast.
Yeah, I think that.
This is everything for me that podcast wasn't, and everything for me that the podcast. What was the other one with the kids in the van and the art? Broken Hearts. Like this is. It could be so voyeuristic. We have the daughter of a serial killer working with a reporter to flesh out a story. It could be a disaster, and it is the opposite of a disaster for me. It's funny, all the complaints that you and Toby have, Kevin, about sort of like the restraint of the first 3 episodes and the sort of like the things it does. To me, those are the things that make the 4th episode work. Because if we started there, I would be calling bullshit, just like April does in that episode. But the integrity of the first 3 build the foundation for me upon which now I am willing to go to whatever crazy place this podcast goes, because I have so much trust in what they're doing. I am in love with The Clearing. I think it's one of the best things I've listened to in a very long time. I very often say on this show that like I only listen to what I have to listen to review it, and then I'll never talk about it again. Like I am going to be listening to this podcast every week until it's over. I love it. It's going to be first on my playlist. Kevin, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down for The Clearing?
I'm a thumbs up. Like I said, that it was a really good podcast, and then you get to episode 4, and all of a sudden, I mean, it's a fantastic episode. I can only hope that it means that it's taking the podcast in a great way. I will. Can I tell you though what the thing I really hate about the podcast is? The name.
The Clearing?
The Clearing.
What does it mean?
Is we're going to be clearing somebody, so this is the clearing of them?
No.
It's not about a clearing in the woods, right?
Well, that's where they went.
Found.
That clearing where they went, where the pond was, right?
That's her memory.
That clearing?
I kind of think...
See, because I think the place is like we're clearing...
No,
like
it's the place. Because remember the place of her childhood.
Was it clearing?
Yes. Now it's time for my favorite part of the podcast, a little something I like to call the crime
of the week.
The crime of the week. Call it a nothing burger.
Nothing burger.
An officer at the Marion County Sheriff's Office in Indiana said he was the victim of a food vandal. He's accused someone at the local McDonald's of taking bites out of his McChicken sandwich before he could eat it. Dun, dun, dun. That's where I would put that stinger in. The officer put the meal in the refrigerator and came back for it after his 7-hour shift. But when he unwrapped it, he saw several bites had been taken out of it. Now, this wouldn't have been the first time some fast food worker has shown their displeasure with law enforcement by adding to their order something like spit or urine or whatever.
Special sauce.
But the officer went back to the restaurant to complain, and the manager offered to give him more food, but he refused. This case of food tampering spawned investigations by both the sheriff's office and the Golden Arches. And it turns out it wasn't a Mickey D's employee after all. The cop simply forgot that he ate part of the sandwich before putting it in the fridge, failing to identify his own teeth marks on that bun.
Kind of overreacted.
That's an inexact science.
And the
That's
officer,
right. It's not his fault.
It's pattern forensics. The officer has since issued an apology to McDonald's. So, panel, this officer seems to be very, very sensitive. So my question for you is, what other innocent thing did he mistake for a slight? Laura Bricker, what do you think?
I'm going to go with the obvious, not putting toilet paper on the toilet paper roll when it's empty, because he used it himself. After going to McDonald's. No, you're going to have to cut, but
You're thinking of Taco Bell.
Toy Ball, what do you think? The innocent thing that may have happened that this officer mistook for a slight?
I feel bad for his wife when he can't find the remote.
What about you, Kevin? What do you think?
Well, he's always upset because none of the people in lockup will say hi to him. He always has to say hi to them first. It's like, why aren't they saying hi? And he gets really upset about it.
That's very good.
That could be tough.
All right, we should probably end it on that note. But before we do, Laura Bricker, do we have a cat of the week this week?
Oh, yes, we do. We've all heard of the most dramatic rose ceremony ever. What about the most dramatic catnip ceremony of them ever?
What?
Jennifer Little McCord has sent me a picture, several, and she sent me a video of her cat, and she wants him to be the first catchler. And here is what he has to say.
Catchlerette. Are you going to be the catchler?
And then she also made him into a calendar with each month different outfits, but too many people wanted the calendar, so she had to discontinue it. So I think that
it was too successful.
It was too successful.
She had to stop it.
So Catchler is the cat of the week.
I don't know if that's more or less bananas than the Bundyville people and this cop who thinks that guy killed John Benet Ramsey. I don't know. I don't know. We should probably really wrap it up on that note. Laura Bricker, if any more of our wonderful and definitely not bonkers listeners want to send you their animals to be cat/dog/pet of the week, how can they find you online?
At Laura Bricker.
And Toy Ball, people want to reach out to you and say, hey, I didn't like the first 3 episodes of The Clearing either, but number 4 turned it all around for me. How can they find you on Twitter?
I'm sure there's going to be a barrage of tweets about that. At TobyBallNH.
And Kevin Flynn, if people want to reach out to you and remind you how to spell crime, how can they find you on Twitter?
I'm at Kevin P. Flynn.
And if you want to follow me on Twitter or Instagram, you can find me at Reb Lavoie. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Crime Writers On, and I encourage you.
Are you going to be the catchler?
I was watching the video again. I'm sorry.
And I encourage you to join the amazing community in our official Crime Writers On Facebook discussion group. We also have a regular old Facebook page, by the way. Support the show on patreon.com/partners in crime media. You'll get the Crime Writers On after show right now. Plus, Marry with Podcast, Toby's Balls Deep Dive Book Club podcast with Madeline fucking Barron and Laura Bricker's Leave It to Bricker podcast. Our theme song was performed by the New York Ska Jazz Ensemble and used with permission. This show was recorded in the Yoga Loft above the Bodega in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi studio, otherwise known as Studio C, the closet in our basement where I definitely made that chicken, even though you can clearly see the KFC buckets right there. On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for listening. We will catch you
later.
What was like coming down here as late as possible so I could watch the little bit of the opening of the debate, but the audio quality on the debate is so bad. I feel like I was listening to a terrible podcast that we had to review. CNN is a giant television station. I make a fucking podcast in my basement and my audio quality is 1,000 times better than CNN's. How is that possible?
Partners in Crime Media. Want the same expert advice you get from the pros in the store while shopping online at DiscountTire.com? Meet Treadwell, your personal online tire guide that matches you with the perfect tire for your vehicle. Get your best match in 1 minute or less with Treadwell by Discount Tire.